Hi everybody, and welcome to my third of 3 videos on this, the Minolta Alpha 9, and this video is going to be exclusively about this camera's custom features. And there's a link in the description below to a BH photo video site webpage that lists all of these features. So if you want to follow along, just click the BH photo video link and it'll take you there. To access the custom features menu, we have to lift up this side door on the side of the camera. And now we're going to push down these 2 buttons on the bottom together to bring up the menu on the LCD screen. You don't have to push them down at the exact same time. You can push ISO and then the one behind it, and the menu screen will pop up. So here we are, Custom Feature 1. Custom Feature 1 is the autofocus release priority. If you have it at 1, it's going to be autofocus priority. If you have it at 2, it's going to be release priority. And you can see that because it says RP there, release priority, nothing, so it's autofocus priority. And the control wheel on the back here is what I can use to adjust the setting. This control wheel on the top will take me to the next custom function. Custom function 2 is film rewind start. Setting 1 is automatic and setting 2 is manual. The default setting for this is automatic, which is what I use. Now what that means is that with automatic, as soon as the camera reaches the end of the roll, it starts rewinding. With manual, the camera will not rewind until you tell it to, even when it reaches the end of the roll. So I want it to do that automatically. Custom function 3, setting 1 is the default, and this is the film tip. With setting 1, the film is completely rewound into the cartridge. Good, that's what I want. Setting 2, a leader is left out on the cartridge after rewind. You can do that if you want to. I prefer not to because I don't want to accidentally reuse a roll of film. And custom 3, the leader is left out after the rewind and the camera is set up for a mid-roll reload, meaning let's say that you take 12 photos on your shot, on your roll. You hit rewind with custom function 3 here. It's going to rewind it and leave out a leader, plus the next time you put a roll of film in, it's going to start at frame 13, assuming you've put the same roll of film back in. So this can be good if you're going to do that, but it can also be a good way to waste film if you're not. I tend to just like to leave it at 1 and have it remove the film leader so I can look at my cassette, know there's no film leader, and that it's ready to go off for processing. Okay, custom function 4, here we are. The default on this is setting number 1. Custom function 4 is the DX memory. 1 is DX memory off, 2 is DX memory on. So DX code memory off. What this means is that every time you put a new roll of film in, the camera will read the DX code and and shoot based on what that DX code is. So this is really good if you're going to be shooting different ISOs throughout the course of a day. DX memory on. Let's say that you're shooting Tri-X, Kodak Tri-X, and you're going to shoot it all at 3200. Well, it's got a DX code for 400, and unless you want to go in and manually set the overexposure on every single roll, which if you're shooting a sports event, you might shoot 40 rolls, let's say. You don't want to do that every time. So if you leave this, the camera will remember from roll to roll how much to overexpose each roll of film with the ISO, the DX code that was used previously. So if you have a bunch of the same film and you're over or underexposing it all throughout the course of a shoot, this is the option you want to use to just save you a bunch of time. Custom function 5 is your release lock, and option 1 is the camera default. There's also option 2. Option 1 is release lock off, option 2 is release lock on. With option 1, as we saw in the second video, I was able to demonstrate the shutter being released with the film back open and things like that. With option 2, the shutter will only be released if there's film in the camera and the film back is closed. Option 2 will prevent you from accidentally taking photos without film in the camera or with the film back open. This one's just a matter of personal preference, 6 one way, half dozen the other as to which one you want to use. Custom function 6, focus hold button for the lens. This only applies to lenses that have a focus hold button on it, and 1 is the default on this. 1 means that If a lens has a focus hold button, pressing that button will hold the focus. It allows the camera to communicate with the lens and know when the focus hold button is pushed. Option 2 is spot focusing. With option 2, if you push the focus hold button on the lens, then it changes your focusing to only the center part of the frame. So instead of being a focus hold button on the lens, it becomes a center focusing override. And with option 3, it sets it to continuous focusing. So selecting the focus hold button will allow the camera to do continuous focusing on moving objects, which means with a lens that has focus hold on it, you can set your autofocus mode to single shot and then override that to continuous by pushing the focus hold button. So those are your 3 options for how a lens with a focus hold button will operate on the camera. Custom function 7, the default is 1 again. It's 1 on all of them, actually. This is the eyepiece sensor function. With option 1, the eyepiece sensor is only activated when the grip sensor is activated. You will have to hold the camera in order for the eyepiece to start. With option 2, the eyepiece is activated anytime the camera is turned to on. So setting this to option 1 is a good way to make sure that the Eyestart will not work unless you are holding the camera. So if it's just around your neck, the Eyestart shouldn't work if you have it set to option 1. Custom 8 is the frame counter. Again, 1 is the default, and this indicates that the frames will count upward. If you set it to 2, frames will count downward. Custom function 9 is your autofocus button and how it works. Option 1 is the default. And with option 1, your autofocus button will be used to specify an autofocus point. With option 2, the autofocus button is used to select spot focus, meaning that regardless, if you hold down the AF button with option 2, regardless of what is in the frame, only the center autofocus point will be used for autofocusing. Custom function 10 is the auto exposure lock button here on the back, right there. And this defaults to 1 again. With option 1, you press it to activate it, hold it down, and release it to cancel. With option 2, which is the better option, you press it to activate it and press it to cancel it. With option 2, you don't have to hold the auto exposure button down the whole time, which is a lot more convenient for shooting and means that if you are going to have, say, a few seconds between when you take your meter reading and when you take your photo, you don't have to hold the auto exposure button for that whole time. Function 11 is your bracketing sequence. And when you auto bracket, which is done through the drive dial right up here, which are the green button ones on the side there. When you auto bracket, you will take 5 pictures. And so with 1, which is the default, you first take your normal exposure, which is your properly exposed photo, then an underexposed by half a stop, overexposed by half a stop, underexposed by 1 stop, overexposed by 1 stop. With option 2, which is the one I tend to prefer, it takes underexposed by 1 stop, underexposed by a half, proper, overexposed by a half, overexposed by 1 stop as your bracketing order. Function 12 is your rewind speed. Again, 1 is the default. And fast rewind, which allows the camera to rewind an entire roll of 36 exposure film in about 6 seconds. Or slow rewind, which is also it's quieter. I wouldn't say it's much quieter. It's somewhat quieter. Takes 9 seconds for the camera to rewind the film. So slow rewind is good if you're at a sporting event like golf or if you're out doing nature photography. Custom function 13 is your meter and data panel illumination display duration. So you've seen this little button here. When you flick it, it turns on a green light that illuminates this panel. So 1 is the default, and it's a 5-second illumination. 2 is a 10-second illumination, which is what I like. And 3 is a 30-second illumination, which is just a little bit too long. So that's just a matter of personal preference, how long you want to have the LCD lit up for when you activate the light. Custom function 14 is your AF display area, and again, 1 is the default on it. Your option 1 is that your focus area LEDs display the active focus area for 1/10 of a second after focus locks. Option 2 is 0.4 seconds after the focus locks. And option 3 is only if the AF button is pressed. So I like a slightly longer AF confirmation light, so that's why I leave it at 2. But again, this is one of those matter of personal preference things. Custom function 15 is your Eyestart switch, and with option 1, which is what I have it set to, it turns Eyestart on and off. With option 2, it turns dial lock on and off, and Eyestart is always on. And with option 3, it turns dial lock on and off, but Eyestart is always off. And dial lock is, that's this dial right here and this dial right here. So what you can do is use custom function 15 to have your Eyestart button down here. Instead of controlling your Eyestart, prevent these dials from rotating so that the if you're out shooting and you don't accidentally change the aperture or shutter speed before a photo and end up with a bad exposure. And then options 2 or 3 are just whether or not you want to use Eyestart. I'm happy not having a dial lock, so if you want to have your dials locked when use the Eyestart button for that, options 2 or 3 are the ones to choose. Custom function 17 is your AF drive speed, and option 1 is speed priority, and option 2 is silent drive. So it has to do with how quickly it focuses and how quietly it focuses. I mean, screw drive autofocus is always a little bit noisy to begin with, but if you want to have it be a little bit quieter, you can switch to option 2 in custom function 17. Custom function 18 is your control dial tasking. Control dial 18 controls how these dials, the front and the back, work in different modes. So option 1 is your default, and what that means is that in program mode, these 2 dials have no function whatsoever. In aperture priority mode, both of them control the aperture, and in shutter priority mode, both of them control the shutter. In manual mode, they operate the aperture and shutter as they're supposed to. In option 2, in program mode, the front button changes the shutter speed, and the back button changes the aperture. So that allows you some control in program mode over how the image is going to turn out. In aperture priority mode, they both control aperture, and in shutter priority mode, they both control shutter. And in option 3, in program mode, the front button, this has no function whatsoever, and the rear button takes care of exposure compensation, so you can use the rear button instead of the exposure compensation dial. In aperture priority mode, the front dial controls the aperture, and the rear dial is for exposure compensation. And in shutter priority mode, the front dial is for shutter, and the rear dial is for exposure compensation, which makes 3 a fairly useful feature for doing exposure compensation in any of the modes that aren't manual. Now, one thing to note is that in custom function 2, you compare this with custom function 13, and you can use this to adjust the program line after exposure's been locked in auto exposure lock. So that's a useful way of using custom function 2 with program mode and auto exposure lock. Custom function 19 is your control dial exchange control. Option 1 is the default. Option 2 reverses what we just heard in custom function 18 about what the front and rear dials do. Custom function 20 is your flash metering, and option 1 is that it uses 4-segment flash metering, which is where some of the flashes, not all, some of the flashes that can communicate with this camera can use the light meter in the camera, can use 4 of those segments to control the flash intensity when they're used, and does that automatically. Option 2, the flash uses an average meter. It takes all of the light from the scene, averages it, and uses that for controlling flash intensity. And in 3, it's a spot metering. It uses just the center focus point in the viewfinder to control flash intensity. This only applies if you have one of the flashes that can communicate with the camera and use the camera's meter to control flash intensity. If you don't have one of those, custom function 20 doesn't do anything for you. And the last one, custom function 21, is your exposure compensation display. And with one, you have no display, meaning that the LCD here will not indicate whether or not you have exposure compensation. But with two, it will indicate whether or not you have exposure compensation on the LCD on top of the camera. I like having it on top of the camera so I know what's going on. Just a matter of personal preference on that one. And that is it. That is all 21 of the camera's custom functions, so that you know what they do and how to set them up to your personal preferences. So if you have any questions or comments about this video, please let me know. If this video was helpful, please leave me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track and producing content which is useful to you. If you're an amateur photographer who's taken photos with the Minolta Alpha 9, by all means, please feel free to leave a link to those albums in the comments below. And you can subscribe and find out when I have more videos coming. And one last thing, thank you guys for watching. Take great photos.